My husband laughed when his boss called me a loser. I did not answer. I set my coffee cup down on the marble bar, slid the wedding ring from my finger, and asked one simple question. Are you certain? The room went quiet. In the way rooms go quiet, when something invisible has shifted. My husband kept smiling, unaware that the woman he had just let a stranger humiliate was the sole owner of the very company that paid his salary. I had carried that secret through 7 years of marriage. But that night, one careless joke made me decide it was time to let the truth speak for itself, and the man who would pay for it was not going to be me. The party that evening had been organized to honor the top performers of Whitlock Meridian Group's largest subsidiary, a firm that manufactured precision components for the aerospace industry. Amara Whitlock arrived in a black dress with no jewelry beyond a thin gold chain, her hair pulled back in a low knot, her expression calm in the practiced way of a woman who had learned long ago that composure was its own kind of armor. Callum Reeves walked beside her in a rented tuxedo, adjusting his cufflinks every few minutes, scanning the room the way a man scans a room when he is looking for someone whose approval he has decided to chase. He introduced her to colleagues with the same flat sentence each time. This is Amara, my wife. There was no warmth in it, no pride, nothing that suggested he thought the introduction mattered. The ballroom that night was full of the particular noise of people trying to be noticed, glasses clinking a fraction too loudly, laughter arriving a beat before the joke actually landed. Amara moved through it the way she always did, unhurried, watching more than speaking, aware that most of the people in the room had no idea who actually signed their annual bonuses. She had built a habit of standing slightly apart from the center of attention at these functions, close enough to observe, far enough to remain unremarkable, and for 6 years that habit had served her well. Tonight it would not be enough. Blaine Mercer noticed her from across the room and crossed the floor with the easy stride of a man who believed every space belonged to him the moment he entered it. He asked what she did for a living, and Amara answered simply that she managed a portfolio of private investments. Blaine laughed before she had finished the sentence, glancing at Callum as though inviting him to share the joke, and Callum obliged with a small chuckle of his own. Blaine began needling her, suggesting there were women who preferred to live comfortably off a husband's paycheck rather than build anything of their own. And Amara let the comment pass without flinching, because she had heard versions of it before from men who mistook silence for surrender. A few feet away, 2 junior managers exchanged a glance and lowered their voices, sensing the shape of what was happening, even if they could not name it, and one of them quietly excused herself toward the bar rather than watch further. Blaine did not notice. Men like him rarely did, accustomed as they were to rooms that rearranged themselves around their opinions without complaint. Amara noticed everything, filing it away the way she filed away every small detail in every meeting she ever sat through, patient, exact, and entirely unbothered by the performance unfolding in front of her. Then Blaine said it outright, in front of a dozen people holding champagne glasses. Honestly, he told her, you don't seem like anything special. Callum laughed. That was the first real wound of the evening, sharper than anything Blaine had said, because it did not come from a stranger who knew nothing about her. Amara turned to her husband and waited, the way a person waits for a hand to reach out before they fall, certain that in 7 years of marriage, he had at least learned when to step in. Instead, Callum leaned toward Blaine and said she was used to comments like that, as if her silence were proof of practice rather than restraint. In that moment, Amara understood that the injury was not really coming from Blaine Mercer at all. Blaine was simply a man performing cruelty for an audience, the way certain men do when they believe status gives them license. The real injury was standing beside her in a rented tuxedo, laughing along, unwilling to spend even one sentence defending the person he had promised, 7 years earlier, to protect. She felt something inside her settle into a decision, quiet and immovable, the kind of decision that does not announce itself with anger but arrives instead like a closing door. It was then that Serena Vale appeared at the edge of the room, moving through the crowd with the unhurried authority of someone who never needed to raise her voice to be heard. She did not call Amara by her married name. She said only that the board was waiting on her decision, addressing her as Miss Whitlock in a tone too soft for Callum to catch over the noise of the party. Amara glanced at her old friend and answered that it was not yet time. Callum, still basking in Blaine's attention, had not heard a word of the exchange, and Amara turned back to the room with the unsettling calm of a woman who already knew exactly how the rest of the night and the rest of her marriage was about to unfold. 7 years earlier, when Amara and Callum had first met, he had owned very little and wanted very much, a young man with a business degree and a habit of speaking about ambition as though it were a virtue in itself. He had been drawn to her simplicity, the modest apartment, the second-hand car, the way she never mentioned money unless someone else brought it up first. Amara had not corrected the impression, because at the time she was testing something she had never been able to test before, whether a man could love her without knowing what she was worth on paper. She told him only that she worked in investments, and he pictured a junior analyst answering to someone else, never imagining that the woman across the dinner table controlled a portfolio worth more than every company he had ever dreamed of running. Their courtship had been slow and unremarkable, in the best possible way. Dinners at inexpensive restaurants, long walks through neighborhoods neither of them could yet afford, conversations that stretched past midnight about nothing in particular, and everything that mattered. Callum had proposed on a Tuesday, without ceremony, in the small kitchen of her rented apartment, and Amara remembered thinking, at the time, that his lack of pretense was exactly what she wanted in a partner. He did not know, kneeling on the cracked linoleum floor with a modest ring in his hand, that he was proposing to a woman who could have bought the entire building without noticing the expense. She had said yes because of the way he looked at her in that kitchen, not because of anything he could offer her, and for a long time that reason had felt like more than enough. After the wedding, Amara made a deliberate choice to keep living modestly, renting a comfortable but unremarkable house, driving a practical sedan, wearing clothes that were well-made but never flashy. She wanted to know whether Callum loved her or the idea of what she might someday provide, and for the first 2 years the answer seemed to be love, plain and uncomplicated. He brought her coffee in the mornings. He asked about her day and listened to the answers. But the shift began the year Blaine Mercer promoted him to a senior management position, a title that came with a corner office and a salary that finally let Callum imagine himself among the men he had always admired from a distance. He began speaking differently at dinner, using phrases like people of real value and men who had actually built something, phrases that were never quite aimed at Amara, but always seemed to land near her. She warned him more than once, gently, that a title was not the same thing as a character, and that she hoped the promotion would not change who he was underneath it. Callum would smile in a way that was not entirely kind, and tell her she did not understand how the world worked, a sentence that became, without either of them naming it, the first crack in the foundation of their marriage. He started comparing her to the wives of his colleagues, women who wore designer labels to every company function, who spoke enthusiastically about vacations and renovations, who seemed, in his eyes, to understand the assignment of being married to a rising executive. He would mention them by name over dinner, almost absent-mindedly, the way a person mentions the weather, and each time Amara felt the comparison land a little harder than the one before it. She never asked him to stop because some part of her still believed, in those early months, that the comments would fade once the shine of his promotion wore off, and he remembered who she actually was underneath the disappointment. Amara did not dress up more. She did not attend more events. She did not explain herself, because explaining herself had never been the point of the experiment she had quietly been running since the day they married. She only watched, with a patience that was slowly curdling into something closer to grief, as the man she had chosen began treating her presence as a liability rather than a partnership. Each small comment, another brick in a wall, she had not asked him to build between them. Near the end of that stretch, word came down that Blaine intended to select someone for a newly created executive role, a position with real authority over several subsidiaries, and Callum wanted it with an intensity that frightened her a little. He began working later, absorbing every piece of praise Blaine offered like a man starving for it, and Amara understood, watching him get ready each morning with a new kind of urgency, that he had decided he would do almost anything to be chosen. She did not yet know how far that willingness would stretch, but she began paying closer attention, not as a jealous wife, but as the owner of the company whose books he had begun to touch. The distance between them widened in small, deliberate steps. Callum came home later most nights, full of stories about Blaine's insight and Blaine's vision, until it seemed to Amara that her husband had quietly replaced his own compass with someone else's. One evening he told her, without much preamble, that if she were willing to change a little, people would respect him more. When she asked what exactly he meant by change, he listed her clothing, her manner of speaking, and finally suggested she simply stop attending company events altogether. Amara asked him directly whether he was ashamed of her, and though he never answered the question with words, his eyes answered it for him, and that silence told her everything she needed to know. There had been a night, a few weeks before that conversation, when Callum came home from a company dinner and mentioned, almost in passing, that one of his colleagues had asked whether his wife worked at all, and that he had not corrected the assumption. Amara had asked him why not, and he had shrugged in a way that told her everything, a small gesture that communicated more clearly than any sentence could that he found the question easier to leave unanswered than to defend her against. She remembered standing in the kitchen that night, drying a single plate long after it was already dry, turning the shrug over in her mind, until it stopped feeling like an accident and started feeling like a pattern. Not long after that conversation, Amara began quietly reviewing the internal reports that crossed her desk under the name of a holding entity Callum had never heard of. She noticed irregularities in a handful of contracts, invoices from a subsidiary that consistently priced its work well above market rate, all of them requiring final approval from Blaine Mercer. She did not act immediately, because she needed to know first whether her husband had any part in it, and what she found troubled her in a smaller, but still meaningful way. Several documents bore Callum's signature, Nothing that proved wrongdoing on its own, but enough to make her stomach tighten every time she opened the file. Serena urged her, more than once, to simply reveal her ownership and end the charade before it caused real damage. But Amara refused, telling her old friend that she needed to see, with her own eyes, what her husband would do if he believed she had no power at all. It was not cruelty that made her wait. It was the last thread of hope that the man she married might still choose decency, even when he thought no one of consequence was watching. When an invitation arrived for a much larger gala, one that would gather investors, board members, and senior leadership from across the entire group, Amara decided almost calmly that she would attend with Callum one final time, and that whatever happened there would tell her everything she still needed to know. The gala was held in a hotel ballroom strung with warm light, chandeliers throwing soft gold across round tables, set with more silverware than any single course required. Amara wore a deep green dress that evening, simple in cut, and she caught her own reflection in a mirrored column near the entrance, a woman who looked, to any stranger passing by, like nothing more than another well-dressed guest among hundreds. Callum spent the first half hour maneuvering himself into Blaine's line of sight, eager to be noticed, eager to be remembered. When the promotion decision finally came, Blaine, sensing the hunger in him, offered a single piece of advice dressed up as wisdom, telling Callum that he needed to prove he truly belonged among the people who led, rather than the people who simply worked. It was exactly the kind of comment Callum had been waiting all year to hear, and he nodded along as though it were scripture, unaware that the man delivering it had never once bothered to learn anything real about him beyond his usefulness. Amara watched the exchange from a few steps away, holding a glass of water she had no intention of finishing, and felt something close to sorrow settle over her, not for herself but for the man she had married, who seemed willing to trade his own judgment for a few crumbs of approval from someone who barely remembered his name between conversations. She thought, briefly, of the man who had proposed to her on a cracked linoleum floor years earlier, and wondered when exactly that man had started disappearing, replaced piece by piece with someone who measured his worth entirely by rooms he had not yet been invited into. She did not have long to wonder. Blaine had already turned, drink in hand, scanning the crowd for his next audience. Blaine's attention shifted when he spotted Amara standing quietly near the edge of the room, and he asked, with the same lazy curiosity as before, who she was and what she did. Callum introduced her again as simply his wife, and when Blaine pressed further, Amara answered with the same understated honesty she always used, describing her work only in the broadest terms. Blaine laughed, louder this time, performing for the small crowd that had gathered near the bar, twisting her words with practiced cruelty until investment became unemployed and private became lazy, in the span of a few sentences, each one landing a little harder than the last. Then came the line that would define the rest of the night. "You're a loser," he told her, flatly, as though stating a fact rather than an insult, and the group around him rippled with uneasy laughter, the kind that comes from people who are not entirely comfortable, but are far too invested in their own careers to say so out loud. One woman near the edge of the circle looked down at her shoes. A man beside her cleared his throat and glanced toward the exit, as though considering an early departure. Nobody spoke up, because speaking up in that room, in that company, had never once seemed to end well for anyone who tried. Amara looked at her husband, giving him one last chance, the same chance she had given him 100 small times before, to say a single word in her defense. Instead, Callum laughed along and told her not to take it so seriously, insisting that Blaine was only joking, and in that instant Amara understood with total clarity that she had already learned everything this marriage had left to teach her. 7 years of small compromises, of quiet warnings ignored, of a man slowly trading his own decency for someone else's approval, had all been leading, without either of them fully realizing it, to exactly this moment in exactly this room. She reached up and slid the ring from her finger, setting it gently on the linen tablecloth between them, and asked Blaine, in a voice that did not rise even slightly, whether he was certain of what he had just said. He answered without hesitation that he was completely certain, delighted, it seemed, by his own wit. It was at that moment that Serena Vale crossed the room a second time, and this time she did not lower her voice at all, addressing Amara clearly enough for the entire circle to hear. "Miss Whitlock," she said, "the board is ready whenever you are." Callum turned toward his wife, and something in his expression began, slowly and visibly, to collapse. Blaine's smile faltered as the unfamiliar name settled over the group, and he asked Serena, with a note of irritation creeping into his voice, exactly who she had just called Miss Whitlock. Amara did not answer him directly. Instead, she asked a question of her own, wondering aloud whether he actually knew who owned the company he ran with such confidence. Blaine answered instinctively that the board of directors owned it, the kind of textbook response a man gives when he has never once had to think seriously about the answer. Amara asked a second question, quieter than the first, wondering who exactly had the authority to appoint a chief executive in the first place, and she watched the confidence in his face begin to erode in real time. A few nearby guests had gone entirely still, sensing that whatever was unfolding was no longer a private conversation, but something the whole room would eventually hear about, whether they witnessed it directly or not. Blaine attempted a laugh, the same performative sound he had used against Amara only minutes earlier, but it came out thinner this time, less certain of its own audience. He glanced toward Callum, as though searching for an ally, some confirmation that this was all an elaborate misunderstanding. But Callum could only stare back at him, with the blank expression of a man watching his own life rearrange itself in real time. Serena set a slim folder on the table, beside the abandoned wedding ring, and inside it were the documents that told the entire story, without a single raised voice. There were the original incorporation papers for Whitlock Meridian Group, the chain of ownership tracing back through several holding entities, the voting shares, the transfer agreements, and at the bottom of nearly every page, Amara's own signature. Blaine went pale as he flipped through them, his hands moving faster than he probably wanted them to, and Amara let him read every line before she spoke again. "I am not a guest here tonight," she said. "I am the one who signs off on the guests." Callum could not process what he was seeing, and he asked almost pleadingly whether she somehow had some connection to this company, as if there might still be a smaller, gentler explanation waiting somewhere behind the papers. Amara told him plainly that he had it backward. She did not know this company. This company knew her, because she was the one who had built it from nothing, and every person in that ballroom, including the man standing beside her, ultimately answered to decisions she had. Lesson Callum had received all night, delivered not by his wife, but by the very man he had spent the past year trying so hard to impress, a demonstration of exactly how quickly loyalty evaporated among people who valued nothing but their own position. Callum realized, standing in that hallway with his career trembling beneath him, that the only person with the power to protect him now was the very woman he had let a stranger humiliate less than an hour earlier. The audit began the following morning, led by Serena and a small team of forensic accountants who moved through years of financial records with methodical patience. What they uncovered was extensive. Contracts inflated well above fair market value, some by margins so large they should have triggered questions years earlier, had anyone been paying close enough attention. Hidden commissions routed through shell companies with vague, interchangeable names, entities that existed on paper only long enough to move money from one account to another before dissolving quietly. A quiet network of intermediaries that funneled money away from the company and toward accounts Blaine Mercer had spent years carefully distancing himself from on paper, a structure built with enough patience and enough legal cover that it might never have been discovered at all, had a man not made the mistake of humiliating the one woman in the room with the authority and the will to look closely. The forensic team worked in a windowless conference room for the better part of 2 weeks, stacks of contracts organized by date and vendor, spreadsheets projected across a wall of monitors that tracked payments flowing outward through a maze of intermediary accounts. Serena led the effort personally, cross-referencing every signature against calendar records and email timestamps, building a timeline precise enough to withstand scrutiny from regulators, shareholders, or anyone else who might one day ask hard questions about what had really happened inside the company. Amara reviewed the findings each evening, reading every page herself rather than relying solely on summaries, because she had learned long ago that the details people leave out of a summary are often the details that matter most. Beneath the larger pattern of Blaine's manipulation, a smaller but more painful thread emerged. Several documents bearing Callum's signature, authorizations he had approved without asking the kind of questions a more careful executive might have asked. Callum insisted, with visible desperation, that he had never understood the full scope of what he was signing, that Blaine had a habit of presenting paperwork as routine and urgent in the same breath, discouraging the kind of scrutiny that might have slowed things down. Amara did not simply take his word for it. She ordered an independent review, refusing to let her position as both owner and wife shortcut the process in either direction, aware that anything less would compromise not only the investigation, but her own sense of what fairness actually required of her. This was the moment that revealed the true shape of her character, more clearly than anything said at the gala. She did not use her power to shield her husband from consequences, and she did not use it to punish him beyond what the facts actually supported. She wanted only the truth, laid out plainly, without her own anger or her own hurt shaping the outcome. The independent review eventually confirmed that Callum had signed documents Blaine had deliberately mischaracterized, that he was not the architect of the scheme, but that his ambition had made him careless in exactly the way ambitious men often become careless when they are chasing a title rather than doing the work. "You did not betray me with that signature," Amara told him quietly, once the findings were laid out in full. "You betrayed yourself, the moment you decided that power mattered more than principle." The board convened soon after to vote on the future of both men, gathered around a long table in a room with no windows and no decoration beyond a single framed photograph of the company's original headquarters a modest storefront Amara had rented with her first savings more than a decade earlier. The tension in the room was different from anything at the gala, quieter, heavier, entirely without an audience to perform for, and every person present understood that whatever was decided here would ripple through the organization for years to come. Dorian Cross, who had spent months privately doubting whether Amara was being too patient, too restrained, too willing to give people second chances they may not have earned, finally spoke in her defense, telling the room that her refusal to act rashly was not weakness, but the clearest evidence yet of real judgment. He reminded the other board members that Amara had built the company on exactly this kind of discipline, the willingness to gather every fact before acting on any of them, and that the same discipline had protected the organization from far worse damage than a few uncomfortable headlines. Several members nodded, and even those who had privately questioned her patience in earlier weeks found themselves persuaded, watching the evidence laid out with a clarity that left little room for argument. It was, in its own quiet way, the moment Dorian stopped merely tolerating Amara's leadership and started genuinely respecting it. The board pressed Amara for a decision, and Dorian, still carrying some of his earlier skepticism, suggested that Callum should be removed immediately alongside Blaine, arguing that a clean break would send the clearest message to the rest of the organization. Amara refused to treat the two men as equivalent, because they were not. Blaine had built a system designed to enrich himself at the company's expense, deliberate and calculated over years. Callum had been weak, ambitious, and careless, a very different failure, one born from insecurity rather than greed, though it had still caused real harm that could not simply be waved away. She offered Callum a choice rather than a verdict, laying it out plainly in front of the board. He could resign his position voluntarily. He could cooperate fully and transparently with the ongoing investigation. He would lose any claim to a leadership role within the company, now or in the future. And if he wanted to rebuild any kind of reputation, he would have to do it slowly, from the very beginning, with no shortcuts and no favors extended because of his marriage. She watched him as she said it, wondering whether he would ask for leniency, whether some part of him still believed his marriage entitled him to a softer landing than anyone else in his position would receive. He did not ask for leniency. Callum sat quietly for a long moment, the weight of the room pressing down on him. And then he nodded, accepting terms that offered him nothing except the chance to start over honestly. Callum chose to resign, and something in the way he made that choice marked the first real sign of change Amara had seen in him in a very long time. He did not ask her, as he might have a year earlier, whether she could still save him from the consequences. Instead, he asked what he could do to begin repairing the damage. A small shift in language that carried an enormous shift in character underneath it. For the first time in years, Amara told him, take responsibility for yourself, without waiting for someone else to hand you the outcome you want. Blaine was removed from his position within the week, stripped of authority over every subsidiary he had spent a decade quietly exploiting, and the company began the long, unglamorous work of rebuilding trust with the people who depended on it. But the marriage itself was far from settled. Callum returned home to find Amara's ring still resting on the small table by the door, exactly where she had placed it after the gala, and he asked her, with more honesty than he had shown in years, whether she still loved him. She told him the truth, that she did not know, and that uncertainty was its own kind of answer, one neither of them was ready to fully accept. A few days later, Amara placed a sealed envelope on the kitchen counter, divorce papers, drafted with quiet efficiency by lawyers, who had never needed to raise their voices to be taken seriously, and she said nothing more than that the choice, from that point forward, belonged to him. She had spent the previous evening alone in her study, turning the decision over more times than she cared to admit, weighing 7 years of small kindnesses against the specific weight of what had happened in that ballroom. And she had arrived, finally, at a kind of peace that had nothing to do with certainty. She did not know what she wanted the envelope to accomplish. She only knew that leaving the decision entirely in his hands, without pressure or persuasion, in either direction, was the only way either of them would ever learn the truth of what he actually valued. Callum did not sign right away, and more importantly, he did not pressure her to change her mind. Instead, he began, slowly and without announcement, to become a different kind of man. He sought out Serena, whom he had treated with a careless dismissiveness for years, and apologized directly for the way he had spoken to her, acknowledging that he had judged her competence by her gender rather than her record. Serena accepted the apology without warmth, but without cruelty either, telling him only that actions would matter more to her than words, a standard he found, to his own surprise, that he wanted to meet. He spoke openly with former colleagues about his own mistakes, refusing the easy path of blaming Blaine entirely, and he turned down 2 separate opportunities that would have let him quietly benefit from his old connections, despite everything that had happened. One offer came from a smaller firm eager to hire him specifically because of his former ties to Whitlock Meridian, hoping he might smooth the way toward a future contract, and Callum declined it without hesitation, telling the recruiter plainly that he no longer wanted a job built on who he used to know, rather than what he could actually do. It was a small decision in the scope of a career, but it was the first time in years he had chosen the harder, more honest path, simply because it was the right one, with no one watching to reward him for it. Most significantly, he stopped talking about Amara's wealth entirely, as though the subject had simply lost its gravitational pull on him. Instead, he began asking about the things he had never bothered to ask about before: her dreams, her actual daily work, the years she had spent building something from almost nothing before he ever entered her life. Amara told him, for the first time in real detail, about the small rented office where it had all begun. No family money behind her, no connections handed down, only a stubborn intelligence and a willingness to work through nights that most people spend sleeping. She described the early years he had never asked about. The first contract she nearly lost because a supplier refused to believe a young black woman could actually cover the invoice. The long stretch when she paid herself last so that the 2 employees she had hired could always be paid on time. The quiet satisfaction of watching a company she built from nothing eventually employ thousands of people who never once knew her name. She told him about the nights she had spent alone in that first office, long after everyone else had gone home, teaching herself to read balance sheets from library books, because she could not afford the classes other founders took for granted. She told him about learning, slowly and painfully, which investors could be trusted and which ones simply wanted a foothold in a business too promising to ignore. None of it had been easy, and none of it had been given to her. And as she spoke, Callum began to understand the full weight of what he had dismissed, months earlier, as nothing at all. Callum listened in a way he had never listened before, and something in his expression shifted as the story unfolded, a dawning understanding of exactly what he had dismissed as nothing all those years. This was a woman who had spent her entire adult life constructing something that thousands of employees now depended on for their livelihoods, and he had looked at her and seen only a quiet wife who did not dress the way his colleagues' wives dressed. "I used to think you had nothing," he admitted quietly, and Amara answered him without bitterness, telling him that he had simply believed value only existed when other people could see it. That single sentence became, in its own way, the truest thing either of them said to the other over the course of that long, difficult year, the idea sitting at the center of everything that had happened between them. Eventually Callum signed the papers, and Amara noticed, watching him do it, that this time the act carried none of the panic or self-interest that had defined so much of his behavior before the gala. He was not signing because he had lost. He was signing because, for what might have been the first time in their entire marriage, he genuinely respected her right to choose her own path forward, whatever that path turned out to be. Amara did not file the papers immediately. Instead, she held on to them for a while, telling him only that perhaps they needed to begin again, though not necessarily as husband and wife, a sentence that left the future deliberately unresolved rather than neatly wrapped. Months passed, and the company itself began to change in ways that reached far beyond a single ballroom or a single confrontation. Amara restructured the leadership entirely, bringing in a new chief executive with a reputation for integrity rather than charisma, and she made it clear throughout the organization that people would no longer be measured by their clothing, their connections, or their ability to flatter whoever happened to be in the room. Blaine Mercer eventually faced the full consequences of what the audit had uncovered, his name quietly erased from the letterhead of the company he had once believed he controlled, his reputation among the small circle of investors who had once courted his opinion evaporating almost overnight once the details became public. It surprised no one who had watched him closely, though it surprised nearly everyone who had once envied him from a distance, that a man so certain of his own power had built almost none of it honestly. Amara used the months that followed to reshape more than just the leadership chart. She introduced a review process that no longer let a single executive approve large contracts without a second, independent set of eyes, closing the exact kind of gap Blaine had exploited for years. She spoke personally with junior employees, who had once been too afraid to question their superiors, telling them, in meetings that had never happened under the old leadership, that raising a concern would never again cost someone their job. Slowly, the culture of the place began to shift, not because Amara announced grand new values on a banner in the lobby, but because people began to notice that competence, not flattery, was finally what earned a person a seat at the table. Callum, meanwhile, started over at a much smaller firm, taking a position several levels below anything he had held before, and for the first time in years, he stopped performing importance for an audience that had never truly respected him anyway. He no longer mentioned his title within minutes of meeting someone new. He no longer needed to prove, loudly and constantly, that he belonged in rooms he had once been desperate to enter, and colleagues at his new job would later describe him, without knowing his history, as unusually steady for a man his age, someone who listened more than he spoke. Nearly a year after the night everything unraveled, Callum happened to see Amara at a small coffee shop, not far from where they used to live, an entirely unplanned meeting, with no board members watching, no security nearby, none of the power that had defined their last real conversation. She was reading a paperback novel folded open on the table, and for a moment he simply watched her from the doorway, struck by how little she had changed in appearance, and how much everything underneath had shifted since the last time they sat together like this. He almost turned around and left, uncertain whether he had any right to interrupt the quiet life she had clearly built for herself in his absence. He did not leave. Instead, he crossed the small room and asked if he could sit, and Amara looked up, studied him for a moment, and gestured to the empty chair, without a trace of the coldness he had half expected. There were simply two people, older now in the ways that mattered, sitting across a small wooden table with 2 cups of coffee between them, no title separating them, no company balance sheet hovering in the background, nothing but the plain fact of 2 lives that had once been tangled together and were now finding a new, uncertain shape. Callum asked her, carefully, whether things would have turned out differently if he had defended her that night, instead of laughing along with a man who had no idea who he was mocking. Amara considered the question honestly before answering, and told him, simply, that yes, they would have. He asked, just as carefully, whether there was still a chance for him, and Amara studied him for a long moment before she answered, neither confirming nor denying anything outright. A chance, she told him, is not something anyone gives you. It is something you have to keep proving you deserve, one choice at a time, for as long as it takes to actually mean it. Callum absorbed the answer without arguing against it, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the quiet between them entirely different from the silences that had once defined the worst months of their marriage, easier now, less freighted with everything unsaid. She rose from the table not long after, gathering her coat, and Callum did not follow her out the door, choosing instead to simply watch her go, a small but real sign of the growth that had taken root in him since the night his own laughter had cost him more than he ever imagined it could. Outside, the afternoon light fell across the sidewalk in long, ordinary stripes, and Amara walked toward her car without looking back. Not out of coldness, but because she had finally stopped needing to look back at all. Her attention settled instead on whatever came next, unwritten and entirely her own to shape. A few minutes later, sitting alone in her car outside the coffee shop, Amara's phone buzzed with a short message from Callum. "Thank you," it read, "for teaching me what real value actually looks like." She read it twice, then set the phone down on the passenger seat without answering right away, a small smile crossing her face. Not because she had decided to return to him, but because she understood, more clearly than she ever had before, that she had finally reclaimed the one thing that mattered most through all of it. Not the company, and not the marriage, but her own quiet, unshakable sense of worth, built in silence, long before anyone else ever thought to notice it. They called me a loser because they could not see what I had spent years building in silence. But somewhere along the way, I learned something that no title, no ring, and no man's approval could ever teach me. You do not owe your value to people who only know how to measure what is visible on the surface. Some worth is quiet by design, patient by necessity, and it does not need anyone's permission to finally, fully become undeniable.